So I'm going to talk about public health at home, and by at home, I just mean domestically in the United States. And then Ben Mason-Meyer will speak next and talk about the rest of the world and its interaction and impact on the United States. I'm also going to try to limit my overlap with the other topics, so won't talk about drugs and devices and healthcare. We'll try to limit it to just, everything else. And I also just won't talk much about vaccines, which have obviously been a huge focus of conversation for a good reason, but that would take up my hour just to talk about that. So I'm going to talk about sort of bigger picture issues. I guess two other caveats. One is that I will focus on the federal level, although I think there are important developments at the state and local level as well. And so I'll talk a bit about the impact on state and local public health, but we'll largely focus on the federal level. And then I'm going to try to be blunt about my assessment. I think it's important to be honest and direct about the really unprecedented moment that we are in right now. So, given that, I just want to be very clear that these views are my own, and not those of my employer or any entity that has funded me. So, how is it going? Um, Not well. The public health system really at every level is in crisis. And then I think the legal system is in its own state of crisis in the sense that many of the things that we thought were settled are suddenly feeling, if not in reality, very unsettled. And that includes the sort of subfield of public health law, which I think has been in crisis for longer. So both public health as a field and public health law have really been, I think, clearly in crisis since the COVID pandemic. So it's not that the things I'm going to talk about began in January. It's the continuation and worsening in many cases of trends that began before that, and for some issues, well before that. So what I've tried to do is outline some big picture developments, and then I will circle back and talk about their impact or possible impact, and then if time, talk a little bit about the courts and where we go from here. And we'll try to keep an eye on the clock and leave time for conversation as well. So, I mean, I remember the day after the election, my students, came into the class the next day and asked me kind of what my thoughts were on what public health was going to be like in the second Trump administration. And, I told them, like, I don't know. We will have to wait and see. It could go lots of different directions, but I think the thing to keep an eye on is who is appointed to important positions because in important respects, personnel is policy. And we can see who was appointed and what the impact of that has been. And I really think it should not be a partisan statement or viewed as a partisan statement to suggest that appointing the nation's leading anti-vaccine activist to lead HHS was a bad idea. That was, I mean, not just a bad idea, but truly, I think, historically dangerous and irresponsible. Um, and I would say the same thing of the Senate confirmation. But yeah, that is where we are. And I think it's also important to remember that RFK Jr. is not just an anti-vaccine activist, but strongly endorses and has perpetuated all other sorts of conspiracy theories and misinformation. I mean, he's written his book about that AIDS might not be caused by the HIV virus, that Wi-Fi networks are causing cancer, that fluoridation is being used to poison the public. All these other conspiracy theories that really go to the heart of some of the biggest successes in public health over the last century. All of that it's not a secret. All of that is well known. All of that was widely reported at the time of the nomination and confirmation. But I think it's just important to remember because it just, again, kind of in the flood of everything happening every day, it is sort of easy to forget that that is the case and that is the world that we're living in now. And it's not just Secretary Kennedy, it is the team that has now come to lead other important parts of HHS as well. So, I mean, the leadership of HHS is in a sense split between those who like Jay Bhattacharya, who is now the director of NIH, Marty McCary at the FDA. There are people like that who were COVID contrarians and are really sort of motivated by their views of what happened during the pandemic. And then there are the sort of outright conspiracy theorists like RFK Jr. and those that he has brought in with him. And those two groups, for now, have made common cause, although I'm not. We'll see how stable that alliance is. But what they're bringing to HHS, I think, can be seen as a public health of grievance and conspiracy theories. And at a fundamental level, grievance and conspiracy theories are, in my view, just antithetical to what public health is, or at least what public health should be about. Grievance is backwards looking in that it's focused on blame, it's divisive, whereas I think public health should be forward looking and inclusive and focused on solving problems, not attributing blame. And public health should be built on a foundation of science and evidence. And public health built around conspiracy theories that are impervious to evidence is literally the opposite of that. I just wanted to add, I wasn't sure where to fit this in, but I just think it's important to note that a focus on grievance and propagation of misinformation can also just be dangerous. So I just wanted to acknowledge again, it can get lost in the many, many news cycles that have happened since then, but did wanted to acknowledge the August 8th attack on the CDC, which caused the death of one law enforcement officer. And I think we were very, very fortunate that there was not more loss of life and more harm beyond that. This is taken from actually your local epidemiologist is a Substack account that I think is actually very useful and does really good coverage of public health issues and misinformation in particular. And I thought this was useful for sort of setting the context of, I think a lot of what we're seeing now again comes out of the experience of the pandemic, and public health leaders made plenty of mistakes during the pandemic. I mean, they were responding to an emergency, they were responding to a lot of uncertainty, but certainly they didn't get everything right. And we do need to acknowledge the mistakes that were made and learn from those mistakes that were made and think about how we can respond better next time. But right now, what we're seeing, in my view, is a lot of just revisionism, attempt to rewrite the history of what did actually happen. So we're seeing a lot of claims, or beyond just claims, just assertions that vaccines were not helpful or that they were affirmatively harmful. And if you look at the polling data, it is, I think, about a third, depending on the poll that you look at, a quarter to a third of the public believes that the COVID vaccines cause mass death. We are seeing claims that COVID was not that harmful, that social distancing measures were pointless. Uh, Essentially, a lot of things that feed into sort of a core belief that the virus was not the problem, but rather the public health response and the scientific establishment and the response of academia was the core problem. And then we're seeing actions that are responding to that understanding of what happened during the pandemic. And those are all claims that, the sort of quote unquote COVID contrarians who now are in leadership positions in HHS made during COVID and have expressed since to greater or lesser extents. And now that they are in charge, I think there's a strong effort and a strong motive to sort of rewrite what the history of COVID actually was. So I think part of the job of people in public health and those people studying public health is to have memory, and to care about accuracy, and to accurately assess and accurately discuss and actually accurately remind people what actually happened during the COVID pandemic that we all lived through not that long ago. Uh, so if you think of this being a public health of grievance and conspiracy theories, then some of what we've seen so far, I think, makes sense. And then you add to that the influences of Doge, the sort of administration's overall goal of weakening the civil service more broadly and bringing it more directly under presidential control, and then Project 2025 and its more ideologically focused plans, which had a key pillar of weakening academia based on their critiques of academia. You put all those things together, I think that feeds into the five sort of big picture developments that I want to talk about here. And unsurprisingly, I'm glad to see that it overlaps with a lot of what Rachel Sachs just said about the FDA, so that these are not just things happening at the FDA, but are happening more broadly across the government. So one, and this was, I think, one of her points as well, um, loss of capacity and loss of expertise. So there were cuts before then, but April 1st of this year was the day of massive, massive cuts to HHS. There were reductions in force of about 10,000 staff across HHS agencies. This was, The Guardian got this picture. This was the whiteboard that people at the CDC were using to try to keep track of divisions that had either had cuts or been eliminated. Uh, since there was no communication, no one told them. So they were literally just picking up the phone and calling other parts of the CDC and trying to figure out who was still there and who wasn't. And this is probably too small to see, but the column that has the most writing under it is the National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. The other one there that has a lot of stuff under it is NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety. Within the National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, was the Office of Smoking and Health, which addresses the leading cause of preventable death. And that was completely eliminated. All of its staff was fired. I believe that is the only division that was completely 100% eliminated. There are programs within divisions that were completely eliminated. NIOSH had a staff cut of about 90%. There were big cuts to other divisions as well, or other centers as well, including the National Center for HIV, Viral Hepatitis, STD, and Tuberculosis Prevention, the Injury Prevention Center, and others. And I think we still don't have great clarity on who was directing these cuts, who was giving input into these cuts. Um, but I think we need to know that. And I also think that it's worth thinking about who benefits from these cuts and who is harmed uh, by them. So, I mean, cutting NIOSH, for example, and OSHA, which is in the Department of Labor, but has been cut as well. Um, I mean, that threatens to roll back advances in occupational health, which is another major public health advance over the last century. And um, I think it is pretty clear who benefits from that and who does not. In terms of chronic disease prevention, I think many people have written about how it doesn't seem to make sense that RFK Jr. has said over and over again that he wants to focus on chronic disease, and the problem is that we don't focus enough on chronic disease prevention. But then there were these massive cuts to the National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention. But again, he's coming in as someone who is distrustful of, to say the least, disdainful of the civil servants who have been working on these issues and believe that they have been getting it all wrong. So he's not coming in as someone who is reliant on their expertise, and thinks that there is only, and he I think believes that there's only benefit to cutting the people that have been there, and allowing new people to come in with a different vision. Um, FDA also experienced massive cuts, including center and division leaders. I think there's a shocking number. If you look at the org chart, there's a shocking number of centers and divisions that have no leader right now within the FDA. Um, some of the people who were let go have been brought back. There was some industry pushback about not having the capacity to do drug and device reviews. There's some more public pushback about food safety, which the public is rightly concerned about. The Center for Tobacco Products was massively cut. Some of it, I think, was an intent to get rid of redundancy, that there were lots of offices with similar names in different parts of the FDA. So it's not clear to me how much of the cuts reflect a just failure to understand that the fact that these entities had similar names did not mean that there was not specialized expertise in them that was really important and really useful. And how much of it was just a desire for centralization and more political control. Um, and I think either motive could have led to the results that we saw. And again, we don't really know exactly who was making these calls or why. Um, NIH2, um, there were four institute directors that were put on leave on April 1st, which is I think unprecedented. I mean, these are not political positions. They typically do not change when a new administration comes in. There are reductions in force there as well. There's also, I won't get into kind of the budget and shutdown and all of that stuff, but I mean, there are um, plans for further reductions, further cuts, further reorganizing in the president's budget that was submitted. You know, I will note that, I guess one semi-positive note, there has been bipartisan pushback from Congress about the cuts to the NIH in particular, and an unwillingness to accept the proposed cuts to the NIH. That being said, I think there's been less pushback on the president's assertion of unilateral authority to cut grant funding. And so having higher funding levels that can be cut at whim is not necessarily great. So we'll see what happens. Okay. So that's one, loss of capacity, loss of expertise. And again, I'll sort of circle back and get back to the impact. Second, and this flows from what I've already said, the anti-expertise turn of public health agencies. You have the leadership of the CDC that was pushed out largely about unwillingness to endorse claims about vaccines. There were strong statements from the former director, from others who resigned, that science was no longer guiding CDC decision making, and from some of them, an explicit statement that communications coming out of CDC really can't be trusted anymore because we cannot rely on them being based on science. That was followed by the sort of autism slash Tylenol announcement, which again, um, I think was not surprising given RFK Jr.'s history, but it was, I think, a bit surprising to get back to what Chris Robertson said earlier that the president showed up and made it a presidential event that he participated in. There are the MAHA reports, the Make America Healthy Again reports that came out, which mischaracterized studies, which has now been they edited them, but the original versions included studies that did not exist that apparently were created by AI. So, I mean, there's all these sort of policy announcements coming out that are not based on evidence. And I think we're going to see more of that and more pressure to do that. I mean, there's, already, for example, Secretary Kennedy has a long history of um, making false claims about fluoride in the water supply. He has announced the a CDC review of that issue. I think there's no question. He knows what outcome he wants that CDC review to come to. And there are going to be more cases like that where there are pressures on those in government to come to a predetermined conclusion. Um, so I'll just sort of echo what Rachel Sachs already said. Uh, Not just for the FDA, but for the CDC and NIH as well. Their strongest asset has been their reputation for trustworthiness and commitment to science. And having that undermined is, I think, a huge, huge problem, and it's not going to be easy to build that back. Then we have more focused attacks on health equity efforts and efforts to address minority health issues. This kind of originated with executive orders, some of which have been very broadly interpreted and applied within HHS, which has led to the closing of offices across HHS agencies that addressed health equity issues, the cutting of research studies, the taking down of data, the scrubbing of website content, in particular, cutting anything that references essentially the existence of transgender people. Um, I would say I had personal experience with an article that uh, Ben Mason Meyer was also a co-author on, of being told to reword an already accepted article at an HHS-run journal, and I know that that has happened to, which we didn't do, by the way, and I know that that has happened to other people as well. Um, so there are those kind of more targeted cuts. There's also been the elimination of funding for the study of misinformation, um, which I think again makes sense. I think the current leadership of HHS saw that sort of research as an attack on them. Um, but I think it is a huge, huge problem given that misinformation just is a key public health challenge of our time. Um, there's also, I mean, in the budget, for example, is an attempt to zero out research on gun violence prevention, and other sort of more attempts to cut out research that is more politically salient. There is the instrumental use of public health research funding, essentially as a cudgel to try to pressure universities to change their conduct in different ways. Um, get rid of that. Some of it um, has been ostensibly tied to a failure to address anti-Semitism, which obviously is very disconnected from the purpose that this money was designed to be used for. And I would just say that, I mean, that approach and the willingness of university leadership in some places to go along with it um, upsets me and angers me as an academic, as a public health expert, and as a Jewish person. Um, so I think we've seen less of it, but I would just keep an eye out for kind of instrumental use of public health more generally. We had during the COVID pandemic the Title 42 orders that stopped immigration um, essentially completely. Based on public health. That order, I think, in the view of most public health experts, was kept in place longer than was justified on the basis of public health. I know that's the case because we have documents from CDC leaders saying that. Um, there's, been reporting now of, Stephen Miller looking for opportunities to find a public health basis to reassert that order. I think other places where there might be a more instrumental use uh, of public health as well. So I think that's one issue to keep an eye out for. Um, and then I think there's the rise of the Make America Healthy Again movement, which is, not necessarily a coherent movement. I think people associated with that believe a range of different things. But I think the latest polling I saw was, about 30% of people or so have a very positive view of Maha, which is not a majority, but is a lot of people. And I think that comes out of very, very understandable impulses, or else it wouldn't be that popular. I mean, to me at least, it seemed like it is giving people answers that they to questions they really want answers to. Like people want to know how to keep themselves and their families safe and healthy in a world that is very scary and has become scarier, I think, since COVID. And I think, the Maha world is sort of willing to offer people clear answers to those questions. Um, but it has an influence on how people think about public health. This is what Davis Wallace Wells, who was a New York Times reporter, described it this way. MAHA is really a kind of public health libertarianism. It is about bodily autonomy. It is about how I can be more in charge of my own health and well-being, and therefore see my own healthiness as a reflection of some kind of behavioral virtue. And this whole category of things that counts as what the system is telling me to do, I'm just going to dismiss out of hand. So, I mean, it feeds into or comes out of, it's kind of both of those things, distrust of government, distrust of industry, which in many cases may be well-founded distrust on both of those accounts. But the answers it is providing are in many cases not based on science. It's more of a I would say, and this is just my characterization, I kind of don't mean to be dismissive, but that it is sort of a vibes-based public health. That is that these sort of things seem like they would be bad. Um, so we're going to focus on those things. And then it's also, as this quote suggests, not really about the public. It's about kind of individual behavior, individual action, individual responsibility. The Maha report, for example, did not mention firearms or motor vehicle accidents, which are the leading causes of death for kids. Did not mention smoking, which is the leading cause of death for adults. It is focusing on a narrower set of issues that sort of I, as an individual, could take hold of for me or for my family. Um, so, what is the impact? I'm going to try to go through this part faster. Um, I think that's it's often we sort of have this problem in public health generally that it's often hard to show the impact of public health because what public health does is work to prevent harms that occur over a long period of time. And if you've been successful, then those things don't happen. But it's hard to show that. Here we sort of have the mirror of it that dismantling federal public health does not necessarily lead to an immediate crisis. Part of that is because things take time. Part of that also is because there still are a lot of people doing important public health work. So the federal government's role is in general to provide expertise and assistance and function as a backstop to state and local entities. And there are a lot of people around the country still doing their best under very challenging circumstances to do their jobs in state and local public health. But what's happening at the federal level, I think, is weakening us severely for the future. People who are gone are not coming back. I'm seeing a lot of friends who have lost their jobs at the CDC and elsewhere in the federal government get new jobs, sometimes really good jobs in the private sector, and I'm very happy for them. But they're probably not going back to governmental public health. It's not clear why you would really want to go into the federal public health workforce right now after you've seen what just happened and know that, I mean, a new administration could come in and cut your job at any point. Um, there is a trickle down impact on state and local public health. So, as I said, state and local public health entities are still trying to do their work. But another thing that the federal government does is provide funding to state and local public health, and some of that funding has been cut. A lot of it is very uncertain, and so state and local entities are now having to cut positions as well. Um, and there's a loss of surveillance capacity and expertise, which is going to lead to a lack of data to identify problems and inform responses. That's a more acute problem with respect to infectious diseases, foodborne illnesses, other things that happen faster, but it's also going to be a problem over time with occupational health, chronic disease prevention, and other areas. And then loss of emergency response capacity. I think it's just truly incredible that we came out of a pandemic somehow um, less prepared to handle the next pandemic that might come in the future. The sort of anti-expertise piece of it, um, trust was already pretty low in public health agencies for Republicans coming out of COVID. If you look at the polling, like that trust has stayed low, and trust by Democrats in public health entities has now crashed as well. So there's one point of bipartisan agreement, I guess, but that's not great. Um, so we have political polarization of public health. We're getting to a point where what people believe about public health depends on their politics, and I think that is just a truly terrible place for us to be. And it historically has not been the case. There have been differences and disagreements about public health, but on a lot of issues, they have not historically been a split that fell upon partisan lines. And I think it's really harmful. We can't solve common problems if we don't have a shared understanding of reality and what those problems are, and what the evidence says about them. I also think that the federal government and federal government leaders endorsing unscientific views empowers officials at the state level and the local level to do the same. So fluoride, for example, fluoride in water is not something that the CDC has any power over. But the fact that RFK Jr. has been vocal about it has, empowered some states and some local governments to say that they are going to end fluoridation of water supplies. Um, on on this point, I think we are losing potentially losing, at risk of losing, a generation of researchers who were doing tremendous work on issues of health equity. Again, I just see it here in my building. The people who have lost funding are the people who were focusing um, on these issues, and um, they are feeling very under siege and questioning whether they want to stay in this line of work, which I totally understand. Um, but we cannot address our growing inequalities without researching them and without talking about them. This is just one example of many, many, many. This is from the Washington Post, did a report a couple years ago about life expectancy, an in-depth report that was great. Um, and you can see, you go back to 1980 and you look at the wealthiest counties in the US versus the poorest counties. This is probably the words might be too small to see, but it doesn't really matter. The big point here is the difference in life expectancy was just not that big between the um, wealthiest counties and the poorest areas, and it has consistently grown bigger and bigger over time. Um, to, to the point that it says in 2020, people in the poorest areas were 61% more likely to die in a given year than those in um, the wealthiest counties. Um, so these problems are real. Our like failure to talk about them or failure to research them will not make those problems go away. We also have had a persistent failure over time to address massive health disparities, uh, differences in health outcomes by race. And again, without talking about them, focusing on them, targeting them, those gaps cannot be closed. Um, we've had the cuts to LGBTQ research have, um, in practical effect, led to a pretty significant cut for funding on HIV and AIDS research. Um, and I think it's also just really important to think about the communicative effect of what the government is doing here. Um, I mean, think about just LGBTQ research for a minute. Um, cutting, like sort of picking out that work and that research and those offices to cut sends a pretty clear message that the government does not think that it is worthwhile to focus research or focus resources on studying those issues. And I think just even that communicative message um, is felt in a very profound uh, way and is extremely hurtful. Um, Instrumental use of public health research funding. I think at universities, and I could, again, I'm sitting in one, um, that there is a climate of fear um, and self-censorship of being fearful of saying anything that might be controversial. I think it's been exacerbated in many cases, like here in Ohio, by state laws. It's been exacerbated by universities not standing up for academic freedom. But I think the these trends are just really terrible for open-ended academic inquiry, and that in the long run is really bad for public health, which is what this letter from a number of Nobel laureates was referring to. It also, I think, has an impact on students in the future public health workforce. This is probably not news to anyone who is in public health, um, but the sort of basic model of health disparities being driven by social determinants of health or social drivers of health, like income, by neighborhood and physical environment, education, food, and then the role of racism and discrimination. Like this is the work that researchers have been doing, and I think have really driven um, a lot of knowledge gains in the field of public health over the last 20 years. I think the ability to recognize um, the importance of the broader context is really important to having an effective approach to public health. And, we're now at the point where people are just scared to talk about these things. I was on a call earlier this week where someone who teaches at the University of Florida said that they are not allowed to use the term social determinants of health on their syllabi. And I think there's even kind of fear of kind of talking about it. Um, so, and then finally, um, again, this is based on sort of very real, the rise of Maha, I think is based on very real concerns. Um, and I think it, comes out of a very understandable instinct to sort of get back to the basics, to cut out food additives, to sort of get back to natural foods, like, and those things some of those things I think are very good. Um, but the response to problems can be I mean, to be effective, I think has to be based on evidence. And so, some of those concerns are based on evidence and some are not. Um, and I think a very individualistic approach is going to drive continued increases in disparities, as well as stigmatization of those with diseases, particular diseases. And I'll just speak personally again. Um, One part of the MAHA report is about overdiagnosis of ADHD and the idea that ADHD may be caused by food additives or by giving kids medicine or by living in single parent homes. And it talks about ADHD medicines being overprescribed and harmful. I will say, as someone with ADHD, which is not something that I talk about often in public, but as someone with ADHD who has benefited tremendously from medication. And those are not just falsehoods, but stigmatizing falsehoods. Um, and ADHD medicines have been really hard to get in recent years because of shortages. And I am truly scared that there will be policy changes that will make that problem even worse. Um, I think there's also like Maha's is a target-rich environment for grifting. That's a whole other discussion, but I think it further undermines trust in public health when that happens. I saw a message that probably tells me I'm almost out of time. Um, so um, just really quick on the law piece. Um, I mean, it was kind of like it was a trip to try to teach public health law last spring. Um, because it was just thing after thing that was happening that was not supposed to be how this system works. Um, so, I mean, that's ending of programs that are mandated by Congress, treating executive orders as if they supersede laws passed by Congress. Now, since then, I think we've seen more of the Supreme Court allowing things that seem to be clearly in conflict with settled law to happen, um, overturning lower court orders without providing any reasoning. So there's this sort of destabilization of law in general, but a lot of it relates to, and a lot of it is falling on public health. Oops. Um, the Kennedy versus Braidwood case um, might get talked about later. I don't want to get into the details. But in part, it's seen as a win for public health because the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force survived the associated ACA mandate that private insurance companies have to cover preventive health services without cost sharing, survived. Um, but it came at a pretty substantial cost. And I think it is part of the trend of the unitary executive theory, sort of working its way from theory into law, that the Supreme Court basically said that that uh, the task force and the mandate were okay because the secretary had the ability to fire current members, appoint new members, basically direct what the task force was going to do. And I think we may well see other guardrails intended to ensure some measure of scientific independence within HHS agencies coming down. And it gets back to the point that I made earlier that Rachel made as well, um, that trust in the scientific integrity of these agencies is really important. And taking down those guardrails, I think, is going to be problematic. Um, I think there are kind of even more fundamental questions about does Jacobson versus Massachusetts and the sort of basic premise that the government can take actions that limit the freedom of individuals in order to benefit public health. Um, can it do that? Are we still living in a world where the sort of social compact that Jacobson talked about, that individual liberty can be limited in order to protect society as a whole, is one of the basic functions of government? Um, are we still in that world? I would just recommend to you this article by Scott Burris from a few years ago, just sort of laying out that question. Um, I think we've seen a view now expressed by some judges, including some Supreme Court justices, um, that at least some of the public health measures imposed by COVID were tyranny, and are not things that um, the government should have been able to do. I think that is very much in alignment with RFK Jr.'s view. His catchphrase during COVID was, quote, "We have to love our freedom more than we fear a germ." I think that is in significant tension with the basic premise of Jacobson, that we as a society can and have to use our collective tools to respond to collective threats. And I think that's going to be um, I think that tension is going to have to be resolved going forward. And then finally, I'll just sort of plug my own forthcoming work. This is coming out in a book about the backlash to public health after the pandemic, um, where I think the courts are increasingly having a problematic relationship with facts. Um, and so this is sort of kind of playing around with this idea of post-truth public health law, where the courts are kind of saying, well, people have different ideas about what is true, and so it's not going to be our job to adjudicate that. We're just going to kind of throw up our hands. I'd say that they're doing that in a rather selective, in a consistent sort of way. But at least in some cases, you sort of get that coming out of the court. I think Skermetti from last term could be seen as an example of that, the case about gender affirming care for minors, where the court is basically saying, like, well, even though all of the scientific establishment and all of the research is over on one side, other people think something different. And so we're just going to let states do what they want and ban gender affirming care. And then, we had the argument, I think 2 days ago in the um, case about conversion therapy, where I think the Supreme Court is poised to do kind of say something similar, but do exactly the opposite, and say, well, even though all of the scientific establishment and research is on one side of this, um, people have different views, and really, who are we to say? And so it would be a First Amendment violation to restrict the ability of people to engage in conversion therapy. Um, so Rachel already talked about, sort of attempts to fill the gaps with respect to the FDA. I think there's similar things going on with respect to the functions of the CDC and the NIH. We're seeing increasing polarization at the state level in terms of approaches to public health. I think there might be um, more limits coming, more attacks on CDC authority coming. Um, so we can talk more about that if people have questions about that. But I think ultimately, like, crisis is also an opportunity. I think we need to think about, like, what is the forward-looking vision of public health. I think we need to recognize that the sort of the blowback against public health comes in part out of valid critiques of the way public health has acted in the past, and I can talk more about that if people want to. Um, I think the same is true for public health law. We need to think about what is the academic agenda, what's the litigation strategy, how are we going to not just build back what has been lost over these last few years, but think about where we want to go in terms of creating a consistent doctrine around public health law. Um, and then just last thing I'll say is, we will see the impact of these things unfold over time. And while I was putting together this presentation, I got this email from the local school system that we have another measles outbreak here in central Ohio. So I think we are seeing backsliding with regard to basic things in public health that we thought we had addressed, like measles. So we're going to have to deal with those uh, increasing crises that are going to come from that. But again, I think we need to use this moment to think about opportunities as well of where we want to go from here and what we want public health to look like in the future. So I will stop there and happy to answer questions.